Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Kings of History, a podcast where we will be taking a look at all the kings of Portugal in chronological order. Today, on our very first episode, we are going to give you an introduction to what Portugal was, or in fact, what it wasn't, before the birth of King Afonso I, or, as he is known in Portugal, King Afonso Henriques, and all the events that led up to that moment, including the conflict between Christians and Muslims, and some of the most important characters that enabled the formation of a new Christian kingdom in the Iberian peninsula, Portugal. Before we proceed, we would like to remind you all that you can listen to every single episode released so far on our website, kingsofhistory.buzzsprout.com, as well as on the most common podcasting platforms. You can also follow us on social media so that you are always updated regarding new releases and other fun things as well. Drop us a follow and a like, it helps a lot. Let's resume our narration, shall we? Firstly, I want to ask something of you. I would like you to imagine that Portugal doesn't exist, that Spain doesn't exist. The Portuguese people don't exist either, and the Portuguese language isn't spoken yet. We will travel back to the fall of the Visigothic kingdom. This seems quite a great leap backwards in time, but in reality it isn't. Because, after several internal conflicts, the Visigothic kingdom fell into total decline, and then the Muslims invaded the south of the peninsula in the year 711. After the fall of the Visigothic kingdom and several other transformations that we will skip in the interest of time, the kingdom of Asturias emerged, and over time, a series of fast political and territorial transformations took place in the north of the Iberian Peninsula, which, over the course of a few years and for various different reasons, culminated in the division of the Christian north of the peninsula into 4 territories. The Kingdom of Leon, which included Galicia, the County of Portugal, and the County of Castile, the Kingdom of Pamplona, the County of Aragon, and the Catalan counties, one of which was Barcelona. This is the Reconquista. As you can imagine, at the time it was difficult to define borders, and in the Iberian Peninsula, with the exception of a few rivers and some mountain ranges, there were no major topographical landmarks that allowed us to distinguish what belonged to whom and what didn't. For this exact reason, the power and prestige of a king at the time was based not necessarily on the extent of his territory, but on the people within it. And because there were no large defined borders, these territories consisted in a patchwork of several different social groups. Power was also divided, and the government was a mixture of manorial and feudal. Before we move on to the eve of the year 1000, an expression of the French-based historiography that refers to the deep and lasting changes occurring in Christendom, at the time synonymous of Europe, during the decades that spawned before and after the turn of the millennium, we need to refer to the conquest of Porto and Coimbra in the years 868 and 878 respectively. In the first case, the hero was called Vímara Pérez, a Galician nobleman who was then made Count of Porto, roughly all of today's Portugal north of the Douro River. He was the founder of a dynasty of counts that lasted until the year 1071, but more on that later. The city of Guimarães, Vimaranes in Latin, was also founded and named in his honor. This period of time, the conquest of 868, marks the birth of Portugal as a distinct political entity, although not yet independent or autonomous. Depending on the bibliography you might read, or the nationality of the historian who wrote it, this political entity may be called County of Porto or County of Portugal, or even County of Portugal, which in Portuguese may be further complicated by the designation Condado Portucalense, something we don't have an equivalent in English for. To simplify this matter for our English-speaking listeners, we will refer to it simply as the County of Portugal. While the county granted to Henry in 1066 is usually named the Second County of Portugal, since by then it already merged the counties of Porto and Coimbra, but more on that later. Speaking of the County of Coimbra, which spawned south of the Douro all the way to the Mondego River basin, this new territory was a new addition to the Kingdom of Asturias, soon to become Kingdom of Leon, at the time ruled by King Afonso III. While these events were unfolding in the north, Al-Andalus to the south also underwent a number of transformations. The dimension of the power of the Muslims in the peninsula, also called Moors, fluctuated a lot. Depending on the leader and other circumstances, they could either be very powerful and impose some sort of supremacy over the kingdoms of the north, or very weak and be raided or even suffer territorial losses. In the year 756, after a series of revolts and civil unrest that threatened to destroy the newly conquered Al-Andalus, Abd al-Rahman I, an Umayyad prince from Syria, managed to stabilize the situation and crowned himself the first emir of Cordoba. His family, the Umayyads, had been caliphs of all the Muslim world, but were ousted and nearly wiped out by the Abbasids in the year 750. He was the sole male survivor of the massacre. His new emirate essentially spawned from the area surrounding Saragossa, all the way to Toledo, and the areas around today's Madrid, and southwest following the Tagus Basin, ending in the Atlantic shores around the area of the Carvoeiro Cape. A word of caution, this is just an estimation. This meant that between the core lands of the emirate and the Christian kingdoms to the north, there was a huge tract of land, essentially a no-man's land, self-administered by its inhabitants, very loosely submitted to the emir. This presented an opportunity for the Christian kingdoms to the north to take advantage of the punctual instability in the emirate to make advances southwards, conquering, moving about, sometimes even putting on a show of force to incite those communities to join them. So, in essence, the city of Porto was essentially annexed to the growing kingdom of Asturias from its own people and not taken from the Muslims. Then, in the year 929, the emir Abd al-Rahman III entrusted himself with the title of Caliph, essentially claiming the lost heritage of his family in Syria and openly defying the legitimacy of the Abbasids based in Baghdad. This was arguably the golden age of Islam in the peninsula, not so much on territorial gains, or not yet at least, but on scientific, engineering, and cultural achievements. It's ironic that, towards the end of this golden epoch, the phase of the greatest expansion since the days of the Islamic invasion of 711 will mark the beginning of the end of the Caliphate. And that's where we are heading now. We march forward to the second half of the 10th century with a major Muslim threat called Al-Mansur. Al-Mansur became a Hayyib, which was a person who ruled the territories on behalf of the Caliph. A Caliph was the equivalent of a Christian emperor, with both political and religious power. This Caliph was Hisham II, who ascended the throne at the tender age of 10 in the year 976. Due to the young age of the Caliph, Al-Mansur had some leeway to take a more dictatorial and conquering stance. Visualizing the territories of the Iberian Peninsula at the time, the Christian territories, more specifically Leon, Pamplona, and the Catalan counties, were concentrated in the north of the peninsula, while the rest was occupied by the Caliphate of Córdoba. Back to Al-Mansur. Over the course of the next 2 decades, he managed to push back the Christian borders as far as the Douro River and sacked Pamplona, Leon, Barcelona, and the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela until his death in 1002. For the territory that is today's Portugal, this meant the end of the county of Coimbra, since it was wiped out by the Muslim invaders. But the power the Haib managed to attain was the final nail in the coffin for the Umayyad caliphs. Following disputes that arose between the successors of Al-Mansur and the caliphs, the power of the caliphate waned as it was directed to civil wars and unrest. A few years later, and due to the death of the Caliph Hisham II, the Caliphate of Córdoba ended up imploding due to various factions wanting to seize power, thus birthing many independent kingdoms, which came to be known as Taifa kingdoms. Further north, the old Alphonsine dynasty ruled Leon since the days of the Asturian kingdom, but it never really recovered from the attacks of Al-Mansur, and, on top of that, the counties that were part of the Leonese crown were growing more and more independent. The kingdom of Pamplona grew remarkably during these times under the control of King Sancho Garcés III, who acquired the county of Aragon, some Catalan counties, as well as Gascony and Toulouse. King Sancho Garcés III of Pamplona died in the year 1035, but managed to secure the counties of Castile and Álava for his youngest son, Ferdinand. The title of Kingdom of Pamplona remained with his eldest son, Garcia Sanchez III. Ferdinand, who was only 21 at the time, declared himself King of Castile in 1037 and set out to confront Bermudo III of Leon, his supposed overlord, in Tamaron on the 1st of September of that same year, where Bermudo III, King of Leon, aged just 20, died in battle. Since there was no direct heir to the title of King of Leon, after the death of King Bermudo III, Ferdinand became King Ferdinand I of Leon and Castile, by the rights of his wife, Bermudo's sister, and the best direct living representative of the old dynasty. Ferdinand I would spend the next 2 decades consolidating his power, which was hotly contested both by local nobles while also trying to be autonomous from his brother Garcia Sanchez III, King of Pamplona. In the end, the roles reversed. The Kingdom of Castile, once subject to the overlordship of Pamplona during their father's rule, rules over it, vassalizing it. Once these issues had been resolved, in 1055 he made the Taifa kingdoms to the south and west his main priorities. Ferdinand I would spend the next years asserting his supremacy over many of the Taifa kingdoms, demanding vassalage and the payment of gold tributes. On the war front, he concentrated his efforts primarily in the west, managing to conquer Lamego, Viseu, and in 1064 he reconquered Coimbra, thus re-establishing the borders on the Mondego River and pushing the eastern border as far as near Toledo as well. Ferdinand I dies in 1065 at the age of 49, and, as was tradition in the Jimena dynasty, partially influenced by the Frankish traditions, he divided his territory among his 3 sons. Sancho, the eldest, who surprisingly inherited the Kingdom of Castile. This is unexpected, due to tradition dictating that the eldest son usually took the oldest and most established kingdom, which in this case was the Kingdom of Leon. To his second son, Alfonso, he gave the Kingdom of Leon, and to Garcia, the youngest, he gave the newly created Kingdom of Galicia, where the counties of Portugal and Coimbra existed. To his two daughters, he gave two cities on the Douro River, Toro to Elvira and Zamora to Urraca. However, this inheritance plan involving the sibling trio was going to be the cause of a lot of controversy. 6 years later, in 1071, the nobles of Portugal formed a coalition to confront the now King Garcia II of Galicia. But Garcia II wins the Battle of Pedroso and eliminates all the old counts descended from Vímara Peres, conqueror of Porto and founder of Guimarães. Garcia took advantage of this and added the title King of Portugal to his previous one, thus making him, in essence, the first man to claim kingship over Portugal, although in practice the truth is a little bit more complicated than that. The strife in his domains alerted his brothers to his delicate position on the throne, and they joined forces in order to dethrone their brother, and then divide the territory between them. This ended up happening that same year, bringing most of the Christian territory in the Iberian peninsula under the control of the two brothers, Sancho II of Castile and Afonso VI of Leon. However, in 1072, these brothers fell out, and Sancho II of Castile attacked Afonso VI of Leon, defeating him in the Battle of Golpejera, forcing him to cede all his territories, to which the response from Afonso VI was to seek refuge in the Taifa of Toledo. This left Sancho II with almost all of his father's patrimony, with only the cities of Toro and Zamora remaining, which were under the control of his two sisters. Elvira wasn't much of a problem for Sancho II, being easily subdued, but his other sister offered tougher resistance. Urraca put up quite the resistance to her brother's attacks, and during the siege of the city of Zamora, Sancho II ended up dying. But how he died is still a bit of a mystery. There are stories, myths, and folklore regarding this event. Some say that Sancho II was murdered by a Leonese nobleman at the behest of his brother Afonso VI, who was still in exile. Medieval literature, such as Cantar de Meu Cid, states that, on the grounds of this suspicion, following these events, and the return of the exiled brother to retake the crown, the famous and very prestigious knight El Cid, real name Rodrigo Dias de Vivar, made Afonso VI swear on the altar of the Church of Saint Hedia in Burgos that he had nothing to do with his brother's death, in a story that became known as the Oath of Saint Hedia. This is probably just a legend, which passed on to popular culture, especially by the Age of Empires 2 video game in its El Cid campaign. However, it is known that El Cid ended up being exiled a few years later. Going back to the death of Sancho II, he didn't have much time to leave descendants, so Afonso VI came out of exile to claim all the kingdoms that had belonged to his father, Ferdinand I. Although he had a hard time cementing his position diplomatically due to various internal resistances, it wasn't long before he turned his attention to reconquering territory to the south, and in 1085 he achieved what was considered at the time the greatest conquest for the Christian side, the city of Toledo. Toledo was the great capital of the Visigoths and had a central position on the peninsula. Whoever ruled Toledo could claim the Visigothic heritage throughout Hispania, which was ultimately the purpose of the Christian Reconquista. This achievement was so important that it was felt throughout the Christian West, and as such, the remaining Muslim taifas in the Iberian Peninsula were forced to ask for support from a new faction already established in the Maghreb, North Africa, the Almoravids. The following year, 1086, an Almoravid army landed in the south of the peninsula and marched north to battle Afonso VI. This battle took place at Zalaca, or Sagrajas, near Badajoz, on the 23rd of October 1086, where Afonso VI suffered a heavy defeat, which in fact rang alarm bells in all Christendom. For this reason, after the battle, several nobles from beyond the Pyrenees responded to an appeal from Afonso VI to try and heal the wounds of battle and minimize the profit that the Almoravids could make from it. Let's talk about a very important detail to which Afonso VI attached great importance in trying to consolidate his territory: a strong religious policy, because, to date, no other institution had the capacity to occupy a whole territory like the Church. From the smallest village to the largest city, there were no gaps in this network. Some of you probably won't be familiar with the terms that I'm going to talk about next, but try and follow along and try to visualize this hierarchy. The hierarchy of the Church at the time was as follows. Let's imagine a pyramid. At its base, we have chapels. Above those, we have parish churches. Above the parish churches, we have the so-called vicariates. Vicariates are territories that are under the jurisdiction of the vicar, a parish priest himself, but with the task of overseeing his colleagues. Above them, we have the dioceses, grouped up in an archdiocese or metropolitan province. And finally, at the top of the pyramid, we have Rome. With this hierarchical pyramid out of the way, we realize that from the smallest land to the largest city, it was possible to have very effective communication through the Church. And this is what Afonso VI thought of when he wanted to consolidate his territory. But this type of organization wasn't fluid during the first half of the Middle Ages, formerly called the Dark Ages, a term that most historians prefer not to use nowadays, but comprises the time span between the fall of Western Rome and the year 1000 we spoke of earlier. It only became the norm during the 11th and 12th centuries with something called the Gregorian Reform. Afonso VI supported this liturgical and administrative reform, just as his father Ferdinand I did, by opening in 1080 the Council of Burgos to definitively impose the principles of the Gregorian Reform, especially in the new territories conquered from the Muslims, where Mozarabic practices were still the norm. He, Afonso VI, also relied heavily on clerics sent from Cluny, France, to promote the reform, and so all the ecclesiastical centers gradually adapted and absorbed this reform, with the cathedrals being progressively occupied by men faithful to the new ideas, many of them French. One of these centers, the Diocese of Toledo, was an extremely important religious center that competed with Braga for the title Primacy of Spain, and was occupied by Bishop Bernard of Sédirac. Many episcopal members also arrived in Braga from France, one of whom was Henry of Burgundy, who arrived in the peninsula answering the call for aid of Afonso VI. Henry was the nephew of the abbot of Cluny, and would be an extremely pivotal force of what would come to be. With him also came Raymond, his cousin, and descendant of the Countall family of Burgundy, a different family of the ducal family from which Henry descended from. Henry came from the very important and prestigious Duchy of Burgundy, and was a member of the Capet dynasty of the Crown of France. For starters, Henry was the son of Henry, who in turn was the son of Robert I, Duke of Burgundy, who in turn was the son of King Robert II of France. In addition, Henry was also the brother of the two Dukes of Burgundy, who succeeded Duke Robert I, meaning that Henry had a great deal of diplomatic and political influence. We can say that he was a very important person who arrived in the peninsula to help Afonso VI consolidate his territory. And how exactly did the territory needed to be managed, you ask? Well, the old Almoravid enemies, a few years after they withdrew from the peninsula after the Battle of Zalaca, came back, and now they didn't come to help their co-religionists, but to conquer them and the Christian kingdoms. For this reason, some of the Taifa kings who had previously asked for the Maghrebians for help in dealing with Afonso VI now turned to the Christian kings for help. The king of Badajoz, for example, submitted to Afonso VI and offered him Lisbon, Sintra, and Santarém, basically the entire border between the current districts of Lisbon and Santarém. This territory would be integrated into the territory of Galicia, which also included Portugal and Coimbra, and would be given to Raymond when he married Urraca, Afonso VI's legitimate daughter. As for Henry, recognizing his value, his services, and his lineage, Afonso VI proposed the marriage to his daughter Teresa, the fruit of an illegitimate union. But that didn't mean, at least by the standards of the time and for the Iberian Peninsula, that she had fewer rights or was put on the back burner more easily. For all intents and purposes, she would be considered an heir of Afonso VI. Yes, at the time the issues of inheritance and legitimacy were not fully crystallized, and it still took some time for that to happen. For a long time, it was debated why Raymond had married Urraca and Henry Teresa, and whether this was reflected in the greater importance of the former over the latter. That wasn't the case at all. In fact, Henry was the one with the more important lineage of the two, but a marriage between him and Urraca was not feasible, as she was the fruit of Afonso VI's second marriage to Constance of Burgundy, Henry's father's sister. So Constance of Burgundy was Henry's aunt, which meant that Henry and Urraca were first cousins, and a union of this nature was forbidden by the church at the time. Therefore, since there was no familial relationship between the two, Afonso VI allowed the marriage between Henry and Teresa of Leon. While all of this was taking place, the counties of Portugal and Coimbra were ruled by Raymond. But Raymond wasn't at his best, and had already lost territory to the south to the Almoravids, Lisbon being one of them. It was then that Afonso VI granted the county of Portugal, Coimbra, and the city of Santarém to Henry when he married his daughter Teresa. Henry took command of his new territories and immediately tried to start living peacefully and diplomatically with the political powers that existed, who, in a way, looked down on him because he was the missing link in the chain of power that had been vacant since the fall of the old Counts of Portugal. These new local powers would come to constitute the first Portuguese aristocracy, and their power was concentrated in the territories between Douro and Minho, and on the banks of the Douro River. One of the ideals that Henry was accustomed to and brought from France was the feudal system, in which the dukes and counts, despite theoretically being under the king, had a certain degree of autonomy. And Henry began to try and entrench this system in his new lands. Why? Well, this system was ideal so that he could gain some autonomy from his father-in-law, Afonso VI, who by now had adopted the title of Emperor of Hispania, even though it wasn't an official title. At the time, Afonso VI also had no male heir to the throne, which meant that his daughter, Urraca, was the heir to his titles. This pleased Raymond of Galicia, because in the event of Afonso VI's death, he would be prince consort, since he was married to the heiress Urraca. But these plans fell through when, in 1093, Alfonso had a son, Sancho, with a Moorish woman, who was now the heir to the kingdom of Leon and Castile, thus removing Urraca from this inheritance. Even though Raymond was forced to give up his southern territories to his cousin, Count Henry, they managed to maintain a healthy and relatively stable alliance. This benefited Henry in that he was promised, after the death of Alfonso VI, and if he supported Raymond's claims over little Sancho, the lordship of Toledo, something which, being so highly regarded and on the border with the Almoravid Empire, would bring him great prestige. Despite this alliance between the cousins, Raymond ends up dying in 1107, and from that moment on, an unexpected chain of events followed. The crown prince Sancho, son of Alfonso VI, died against the Almoravids at the Battle of Ucles on the 30th of May 1108, and the border sharply retreated to the vicinities of Toledo. The territory lost was on the coast side between what is now Sintra and more or less Figueira da Foz, and to the east the borders also retreated. With this unfortunate turn of events, Alfonso VI, fearing the integrity of his kingdom and to strengthen the fight against the Almoravids, forces the marriage of his daughter Urraca, now a widow, to Alfonso I of Aragon, named the Battler. Alfonso I of Aragon ruled Aragon and Pamplona, two kingdoms that bordered the northeast of the Kingdom of Castile and Leon. By then, he had already acquired great prestige, not only in Christendom, but in his kingdom as well, which even if small, showed great potential for expansion. On the 1st of July, 1109, Alfonso VI died, and Alfonso I of Aragon, who had not only the crowns of Aragon and Pamplona, but also some Catalan counties and expansions south of the Ebro River, now also took over his father-in-law's imperial title, because his marriage to Urraca made him prince consort, and as such, ruler of the entire Christian territory of the peninsula. A short note, Alfonso I of Aragon wouldn't keep the titles of Leon and Castile. These were inherited by Urraca. Since they were married, Urraca and Alfonso I of Aragon would be leaders of the entire Christian territory of the peninsula, but each with their own titles. Unfortunately, we have reached the end of this introductory episode, and at this point, we have Alfonso I of Aragon and Urraca of Leon and Castile controlling all the Christian territories on the Iberian Peninsula. We also have Henry, married to Teresa, who now controls the counties of Portugal and Coimbra, and also the city of Santarém. In the next episode, we will continue our story, where we will finally get to know the first years of King Afonso I, also known as King Afonso Henriques. We will see you in the next episode. Take care, kings and queens.